I think Collins was an extraordinary personality, but he also had an extraordinary image. And they generated a sense of awe at this larger-than-life figure.
Collins was motivated and became a slave to one thing, the freedom of Ireland.
There's a terrible inevitability about that travelling to his doom, because it didn't really matter who pulled the trigger finally. I mean, like Ireland pulled the trigger on him.
Collins had the perfect heroic death. We don't know anything about his future because there wasn't a future. And this makes him there as an image for anybody to project what they want onto.
In 1922, Michael Collins was shot dead here at Bailnham Law in West Cork, just a few miles from where he was born. He was just 31, yet already he had negotiated Ireland's independence from Britain, become the first head of an Irish government, and was commander-in-chief of its army. He was killed here because he'd made an extraordinary journey from the murky shadows of subversive violence to the centre of state power. His willingness to compromise on the rigid doctrines of Irish republicanism earned him an early death at the hands of those for whom he had become a traitor. That death made him the great might-have-been of modern Irish history. It left a void which was filled with all sorts of fears and longings. And now, as Irish republicanism again enters the dangerous terrain of compromise, the image of Michael Collins has acquired a whole new resonance.
This struggle is not over. This struggle is into a new phase. All of us have a role to play in moving it forward. Every woman here, every man here has a role.
The paramilitary ceasefires in Northern Ireland are now well into their second year. And as Republican leaders swap a strategy of violence for one of negotiation, they have the experience of Michael Collins before them as both an example and a warning.
In his own mind, Gerry Adams must be thinking of Collins. He is in a position now where he's calling for talks, where he has allies around the world, in the Irish government, the SDLP in America, who believe that he is ready to do business, that he is ready to forge an ultimate compromise, whether that be for the freedom to win freedom or the end of the matter altogether. And if that's what he's really prepared to do, then he is the virtual reincarnation of Michael Collins. I mean, there's an astonishing repetition of history involved there.
History is also being reenacted Hollywood style. In Neil Jordan's new film about Collins, Liam Neeson is his celluloid reincarnation, superimposing the concerns of the 1990s on the events of the 1920s. On the movie set of Irish history, where image and reality have often been hard to tell apart, Collins is now the most glamorous star.
If you're going to make a film which attempts to hang Irish history on a single heroic figure, which is a pantheon approach which I'm doubtful about, Collins is the obvious, sexy candidate. He is, of course, therefore being presented as a hero for our times.
Since long before our times, though, heroes like Collins have had a resonance that owes almost as much to myth-making as to history. Michael Collins took part in the Easter Rising of 1916, in which a group of radical Irish nationalists staged a revolt against British rule, occupying several buildings in Dublin, including the General Post Office. Led by poets and playwrights, the Rising never had a chance of military victory, but as a symbolic gesture, it was a brilliant success. The climax to its mythic drama of blood sacrifice was enacted when the British executed its leaders. Patrick Pearse and the other leaders became revolutionary martyrs. Although Michael Collins survived, having played a relatively minor part in the rising, he took on their aura. He also set about rewriting their script.
He was very critical of the way in which the Easter Rising took place. And he said, we must learn lessons from this. Never again must we allow ourselves be bottled up in a building waiting to be attacked. And it's one of the significant aspects of Collins the soldier, that he was determined to learn from the mistakes of the past and to fight the next round very differently from the way in which 1916 had been fought.
Interned for his role in the rising, Collins had time to think through a new strategy, combining political shrewdness with military muscle, which he would implement on his release. He emerged into an Ireland that had been transformed by the rising. The radical Republican party, Sinn Féin, swept to victory in elections in 1917 and 1918 under the leadership of Eamon de Valera. Its MPs refused to take seats at Westminster and established an unofficial government in Dublin. Michael Collins took his place in this provisional government, but he also began to direct its guerrilla war. His main target was Dublin Castle, the seat of British power in Ireland for over 7 centuries. Collins's war would be fought not just with guns and bombs, but also with propaganda, and above all, with information.
His men infiltrated Dublin Castle. They reversed the time-honoured procedure whereby the British had infiltrated Irish radical revolutionary movements in advance of any rebellion and had preempted a rising or lessened its impact by arresting rebel leaders. Collins turned the tables, and it was he, or rather his men, who infiltrated Dublin Castle, who reported back to him on which policeman, which intelligence officer was dangerous. And when Collins had the dangerous men named, he had them killed.
Michael Collins was both Minister of Finance in the Provisional Government and mastermind of a campaign of subversive violence, a symbol both of order and of terror. By combining in one person the glamour of the outlaw and the power of the cunning politician, Collins forged a persona that owed as much to folklore as to history.
During the War of Independence, when he was on the run, Collins used to operate out of a considerable number of safe houses. He operated out of several addresses in Dublin. He would organise the financial activities of the Dáil government. He would negotiate with IRA men coming to town. He would try and supply them with guns. He was always on the move.
Collins's guerrilla activity is completely central to the myth of his charisma, of his larger-than-life persona, and of the mystery man, which was an image he cultivated. He's brilliant at getting out of tricky situations. He's evanescent. And that's very important in the Collins myth, is that he's very clever. And he is, in a sense, outwitting the stupid British.
He did have many dramatic escapes, and the publicity of Collins's close shaves, the rumours that circulated about him, for example, illustrated in diary entries by a Dublin Castle official or by a university student in Dublin. These illustrate Collins as a man of infinite disguises. Legends arose of his death fighting on a white horse at the Battle of Rosscarbery. He was the radical chic terrorist of his time. He was the 1920s equivalent to Che Guevara in the 1960s.
Collins cultivated his own mystique, but he also inspired very real fear by using violence that was no less ruthless for the fact that he did not himself pull the trigger.
He was a bureaucrat. He was not someone to go killing somebody himself. He got other people to kill for him. And I'm not trying to say he was a coward or anything like that, but he was a desk man. He was a chief of staff. He kept files on everybody.
In London, other desk men met Collins's War of Independence with equal ferocity. Britain sent in the irregular Black and Tans and auxiliaries to repress what was now being called the IRA and anyone suspected of supporting it. Both sets of desk men depended on information. The British sent undercover agents to infiltrate the IRA. Collins, in turn, used his own informers to identify the agents. He then let loose the Squad, a group of men hand-picked for their willingness to kill for the cause. The Squad's almost evangelical zeal was sanctioned by Collins's own nickname for them, the 12 Apostles. With this implied moral blessing, they went forth to do their master's work.
He thought that the people he ordered killed deserved to be killed. Whether they did or not is another day's argument. But he certainly used to regularly rationalize his killings by saying things like, they were trying to put me on the spot, so I put them on the spot first. It was either us or them.
Collins was very alive to the propaganda value of violence, and he was very alive to the fact that violence, to be effective, had to be not only the right kind of violence, directed at the right targets, but had to be presented with a kind of moral absolution as well.
One of Collins's most brutally dramatic operations came on what was afterwards called Bloody Sunday, the 21st of November, 1920. Members of the Squad called at the homes of British intelligence officers in Dublin. 14 were murdered, a bloody propaganda coup for Collins.
Where possible, Collins avoided violence. But I put this to you. As the war became more entrenched, and particularly when the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans were launched, Collins met terror with terror. To me personally, at my age of my life, I would find it very hard to justify that. But this was a war.
I think over the decades there has been a tendency on the part of some people to play down the road of bloodshed in achieving Irish independence, to emphasize Collins, the statesman, the politician, the head of government, and not Collins, the head of the Squad, not the Collins who eliminated enemies.
Collins's use of force is one that embarrasses people now. And people take pains to justify his force as being minimum force, rather than the kind of terror bombing, say, perpetrated by the Provisional IRA and their loyalist opposite numbers over the last 25 years. But I think that's partly the time. Collins might have used car bombs if they had occurred to him. They didn't.
What did occur to Collins, though, was that his war could be fought on the silver screen, as well as in the streets and ditches. In 1919, as Minister of Finance, he appeared in a fundraising film made by John MacDonagh, whose brother Thomas had been executed as one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. Collins drew all the force of nationalist history into his own image, combining the sanction of the past with the glitter of the newest medium. Relatives of Republican martyrs signed loan forms on a block which had been used to behead Robert Emmet, the romantic revolutionary hero of the early 19th century. IRA men persuaded projectionists in Irish cinemas at gunpoint to show this film. Audiences were left in no doubt about who was the new star of the old epic.
He was very theatrical, very image conscious. First of all, of course, he was secretive about his image during the War of Independence because he wanted to just look an ordinary man on the street so the police wouldn't notice him. But once he came out of the closet, so to speak, in July 1921, he becomes telegenic. He begins to wear sharp suits, and later on, in 1922, he puts on that very keen Free State general's uniform.
The image that we have of him is often that of a man in uniform. But he wore uniform only in the last month of his life, when he was the commander-in-chief of the provisional government's armies. But there are a great number of photographs of him in various different poses. Photographers are always around him, snapping at him.
The famous photographs of him where he's punching one hand into the other and he's looking sideways. He's displaying his profile for the cameraman, I presume. And he definitely was on his way to becoming a kind of political version of a rock star.
He was alert to PR in a remarkably mature way at a remarkably early age. Now, he had the personality to carry it off. I mean, it wasn't faking Collins, it was projecting Collins, the real Collins.
By 1921, the time had come to project Michael Collins, the elusive guerrilla mastermind, onto the big screen of international politics. In July, a truce was declared between Britain and Ireland. Eamon de Valera, the leader of the Irish Provisional Government, had preliminary talks in London with Lloyd George. In October, de Valera sent Collins to London as the key figure in an Irish delegation to negotiate a treaty. Collins also had to negotiate the difficult transition from shadowy terrorist to public man in the eye of the world's media.
Some in Britain regarded Collins with utter distaste and revulsion. The die-hard members of the Tory party, unionists such as Sir Henry Wilson, for example, the former chief of the Imperial General Staff, felt that by negotiating with the Irish leaders, Lloyd George was shaking hands with blood-stained terrorists, and that of these terrorists, Collins was far and away the worst.
I think they were pleasantly surprised when they met him. They expected some kind of a long-haired, wild-eyed, bomb-throwing guerrilla, and instead they found this rather personable young man, rather handsome, very intelligent, and obviously a rather good soldier.
Mr. Michael Collins.
Mr. Collins.
Mr. Lloyd George.
Mr. Collins. Lord Birkenhead, Mr. Churchill.
Mr. Churchill.
Paradoxically, for an Irish nationalist, Michael Collins was in fact quite at home in London. He'd worked there for 10 years before returning to Dublin to play his part in the 1916 Rising.
I think the 10 years in London had a huge effect on him. He ended up with a respect for the English and a respect for the English upper class in particular. He also, I think, had an underlying great respect for English culture. He read H.G. Wells. He read The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I've often thought that his use of young people as agents, go-betweens and messengers was based on the Baker Street Irregulars.
The Michael Collins who arrived in London for the negotiations was a man who had worked in a West London post office and savings bank. He'd once been an ambitious emigrant. Now he was putting his own stamp on history. And as well as the aura of violence, he also brought with him another kind of dark allure.
Well, all Irish political heroes are held either to be enormously Puritan and really not to be interested in women, except in a remote and benevolent kind of way. In other words, to be political priests, if you like. Or, on the other hand, to be heroically fertile.
Kitty Kiernan, a middle-class girl from Middle Ireland, was Michael Collins's fiancée during his transition from outlaw to statesman, and until his death. But in London, Collins appears to have had an affair with Lady Lavery, wife of the society painter Sir John Lavery. In the popular imagination, his reputed move from subversive under the bed to hero between the sheets added to Collins's mythic status.
I suspect going to negotiate the treaty without De Valera was a liberation for him and the high point of his life, to which everything had been leading since his early emigrant days, through his life on the run, to the great turn of the wheel in Irish politics, which he had helped to mastermind.
The treaty, however, fell far short of the cherished ideal of an Irish republic. It gave Ireland limited independence, but the British refused to concede a clean break with the Empire, or an end to the partition of the island that left 6 counties of Northern Ireland still within the UK.
Collins's attitude towards the treaty is, again, there's a famous phrase to sum it up, the freedom to achieve freedom. Collins is no mean phrasemaker. I think his wide breadth of reading in the English classics stood to him in that way. That is probably how he saw it.
He got the best deal he thought he could get in the circumstances. He detested that he had to do it, but he felt it was his duty to do it, and that it could.
Commander-in-Chief of the new Free State Army, Collins buried his friend and fellow treaty negotiator, President Arthur Griffith. Within a fortnight, Collins himself was dead.
Collins was engaged in a tour of inspection in County Cork in August 1922. I mean, it seems an odd thing for a head of government to do, an almost irresponsible action. But he took the view, utterly wrongly, that they wouldn't shoot him in his own home county. And it seems as if he was trying to engage in some sort of private negotiations with Republican leaders, who, after all, had until very recently been extremely close friends and colleagues of his.
There's a terrible inevitability about that, travelling to his doom and trying to make a peace as he did so. And there's a Christ-like quality to it, and there's no point in pretending that to us in Ireland there isn't that resonance of a young man the same age as Christ when he was crucified, making his way to a place of execution, to that appointment with another man very like himself, because it didn't really matter who pulled the trigger finally. I mean, like Ireland pulled the trigger on him.
If you're going to create a heroic myth for anybody, one of the great aids to this is an early death, when the hero is still beautiful, when the hero is still unsullied, before the necessary compromises of everyday life have taken him or her over.
A new image of Collins was fixed at the time of his death. He could now symbolise a sacrifice made so that a fragile new state could live. The wooden cross which marked the spot where he was killed became an icon from which devotees removed holy relics.
Collins, dying as he did, so young, has acquired a martyr-like image. There is a sense of loss, of deprivation, certainty that had he lived, things would have been different. And that with him, as with the Easter rebels, has tended to encourage the development of a cult.
Every year, Collins's memorial at Bailnham Law becomes a place of pilgrimage for the faithful. The link with the past is reinforced by the presence of members of the old IRA who fought in the War of Independence. But with every passing year, the image of Collins is reshaped more clearly to suit contemporary Ireland.
Michael Collins showed an extraordinary capacity for growth and development.
In recent years, as a modern urban society has emerged, there's been increasing impatience with the orthodoxies of the past. But Collins, with all his youthful vigour preserved by death, has come to seem more contemporary. His nemesis, Eamon de Valera, by contrast, lived on to be remembered as an old and remote figurehead. While Collins will always be young and sexy and richly ambivalent, de Valera ruled for decades over a killjoy Catholic state and became a living image of sexual repression and narrow conformity.
To the generations who lived through de Valera's Ireland, which owed a lot in its public image to the stamp of de Valera's personality, Collins represented not only the heroic days of a revolution where everything seemed simple, but also represented, I think, a kind of liberated, unsanctimonious, sexy, exciting future that never was.
The memory of Collins tended to be repressed. Statues of him, memorabilia of his were rejected, tucked in the attic, ignored. He was written out of public ceremonies very much by de Valera and company in the 1930s. And it's really only since the fading of that generation that Collins has come back in a semi-official way.
In Irish politics now, the image of Collins is being reinvented by friends and relations in high places to suit the climate of the times.
Minister for Justice, Deputy Nora Owen.
We are living, as other speakers have said, in a time of change. Over the past 18 months or so, we have witnessed the unfolding of events of truly historical significance for this island. It is widely accepted. My involvement with the peace process has very strikingly reminded me of the linkage between myself and Collins. I attended at the announcement of the joint framework document. And that, for me, was a very significant day because as I sat watching the proceedings and listening to the two Prime Ministers, Art Taoiseach and Prime Minister John Major, I was taken back, I have to say, to a similar kind of meeting that would have taken place in London in 1921 with the signing of the treaty.
Michael Collins' acceptance of the compromise embodied in the treaty was a defining moment in Anglo-Irish relations. The memory of the treaty as both the making of peace and the cause of a civil war continues to haunt the Irish political imagination, all the more so with the prospect of a new Anglo-Irish settlement again in the air.
Since then, in our relationship with Britain, there have been times, I think, when the question of reaching a particular agreement and how it will be received at home, people have thought back, well, you know, what happened at the time of the treaty? We don't want to repeat that, and the split that followed. So the memory of the treaty split and of what happened to Collins may have had some effect on how people have acted in Anglo-Irish relations since then. And of course, there may be people in Sinn Féin who, in deciding what they can do now in terms of the peace process, could be influenced by that memory also, even though Collins belonged to a different part of the national tradition.
I think Collins could be a useful symbol of constructive compromise, but you have to have a willingness, a receptivity to that perspective in the first place, because the treaty can be presented as letting the side down. If one is so disposed to present it, it can be presented as an extraordinary step forward for Irish freedom if one wishes to so regard it. So the motivation will determine the interpretation.
It is precisely because Collins can mean whatever anyone wants him to mean that he is now a potentially fruitful figure for Irish Republicans. For the men and women of the IRA buried here in Belfast Milltown Cemetery over the last 25 years, he meant treason and sellout. But as peace beckons, the occupants of these graves demand of Sinn Féin and the IRA that they justify their bloody sacrifice. In laying these ghosts, the image of Collins as a leader who settled for less than the Republican ideal, but still achieved something worthwhile, is a powerful argument for compromise.
People have become more understanding of the difficulties that Collins faced in 1921-22. And after all, Republican leaders today, after 25 years of struggle, have a lot less to show for their efforts than Collins did in 1922.
You can clearly see evidence of a reappraisal of Collins. For instance, in the Prisoners magazine, The Captive Voice, the Republican in Long Kesh, Tarlac O'Connor, wrote an article there last year calling for a reappraisal of Collins. Now, he wasn't saying that he had changed his own mind about Collins, or that we should all change our minds. He still saw what Collins had done in signing the treaty as directing Ireland entirely in the wrong way. But still the view was there that Collins had tried to do the right thing, had tragically failed, and that shouldn't be held too strongly against him.
The modern IRA tried to claim for its campaign of terror the sanction of centuries of history. It painted its own bloody business as part of a struggle whose heroes had always pursued the pure Republican ideal without mercy and without compromise. But as it became clear that that struggle was leading only to a very dead end, a new kind of hero was needed. In 1993, the TV drama Love Lies Bleeding imagined an IRA on the brink of talks with the British, fiction that was just a step ahead of fact.
When I wrote Love Lies Bleeding, I very much had in mind that talks sooner or later had to come about. One of the things I wanted to show was that in 1921-22, the war had come to an end because of negotiations and talks. And that, it's good to end wars. So I specifically made the leading IRA character, I kind of modelled him on Collins, hopefully, getting some of the personal characteristics, the warmth, the generosity, the regard in which he was held by his community and so forth, but also the pragmatist, the man who realised that talks had to come.
In the past, the problem has always been that faced with negotiations, the Republican movement has been unable to maintain the unity it demonstrated during the armed struggle itself. No one wants a rerun of Collins and Brewer. Bringing the British government to the table, significant advance for us. I want talks. I believe the time is right for talks. But I recognise it is not the end of the struggle.
This struggle is not over. This struggle is into a new phase.
We can, I think, see certain parallels between Collins's change of attitude in 1921 and the attitude of the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin in 1994-95. There are enormous differences, of course. Collins represented the vast majority of the nationalist population. Sinn Féin at the last election represented 10% of the electorate in the north, 2% in the south. So to compare Collins with Gerry Adams would, in many respects, be absurd.
The differences between Michael Collins and Gerry Adams are very real, but there are still some striking parallels. Collins dropped his outlaw image for a place in the artificial sun of camera flashes and made himself a media sensation. Now, following the IRA ceasefire, Gerry Adams is trying to leave behind his own murky past and project the image of an international statesman.
Good luck. Thanks a million. Good luck. Thank you.
Like Collins, Adams was once interned by the British, and he too developed a unified political and military strategy from behind bars. Like Collins, he was once a desk man in a campaign of paramilitary violence. And like Collins, he now has to reshape himself as a democratic politician while trying to keep his more militant followers behind him.
You could almost trace the development of political thought within the Republican movement by flicking through Gerry Adams's wardrobe, and there you would see the duffel coat, the anorak, the jumper, and the suit, you know. And these are the various stages of Gerry with the duffel coat trying to look like a student, with the, you know, or trying in with the anorak to look like the sort of hardy urban guerrilla, you know, the jumper, the friendly matey Adams that you would see, you know, sitting talking to Bianca Jagger. But the suit, you know, is the surprise, and he wears it well, doesn't he? He's a very slick and presentable man.
Collins's very success in reinventing himself as a defender of order in a new state ironically contributed to his own death. Die-hard Republicans could never forgive him for settling for something short of their sacred ideals. But his historic gamble is now an almost irresistible example.
He had to make that huge leap of trust and faith to take steps to bring about an end of violence in this country, and to recognize that people deserved the most significant human and civil right, and that is that of life, that he was making steps and making history in what he had to do. And I think that is the symbolism for me with Michael Collins and today, and it's the kind of courage and bravery that all sides involved today in Northern Ireland and in the two governments. We must recognise that those kind of courageous steps have to be taken by all of us.
Collins's courageous steps led him on the road to his own death. But with time, even those who exulted in that death learned to live with and build on his achievement to create the modern Irish Republic. Michael Collins changed 20th century Irish history because he himself was able to change. As Collins is projected out of the past and into the present, we can imagine an Ireland in which compromise doesn't have to mean death, and gunmen are no longer heroes.